Tuppen, May 1945. Berlin Reich Chancellery. The air in the cellars smelled of damp masonry and cordite as Rochus Misch climbed the last steps into daylight with a white cloth in his hand. He had spent the final week inside the Führerbunker as a telephone operator and courier, a junior member of the SS signals unit assigned to Adolf Hitler's closest circle. And now he stepped into a city that had become rubble and smoke. Tanks sat hull down at intersections. Loose power lines hissed in puddles. Somewhere behind him, the last fires in the garden smoldered over the broken concrete roof that covered the rooms where Hitler and Eva Braun had died 2 days earlier. Misch kept the cloth visible and tried to breathe evenly. He saw infantrymen in long greatcoats fan out from an armored car, their rifles braced from the hip. His legs froze as the first Soviet soldier shouted for him to stop and raise both hands. 2 other men converged and tore the white cloth away, then searched him quickly and pulled the SS sleeve patches from his tunic. Someone said Lubyanka and pointed east. Misch remembered that he had been taught to say nothing and to keep his face calm, but his hands were shaking so badly that a guard pushed him into a wall and held him there until the shaking passed. In the days that followed, he would be moved through makeshift collection points in ruined buildings and railway sidings on the edges of the city. His captors wanted names, positions, and a precise account of the last 48 hours in the bunker. They knew that Hitler was dead, but they did not yet know every detail. In his later interviews, Misch recalled that the questions repeated in circles. Who was present? Where exactly did the bodies lie? What did you see with your own eyes? He would later describe a transfer to Lubyanka in Moscow and harsh questioning by NKVD officers who wanted confirmation that the Nazi leadership had not escaped. He spoke of beatings and of long stretches without sleep. He was 27 years old. He had served as an SS enlisted man in a communications role, not as a frontline commander. In his telling, none of that mattered once the Soviet state decided that anyone from the bunker carried information of unique value. Misch would spend years in captivity and forced labor, a journey that began with this moment in Berlin as a line of prisoners snaked past a knocked-out tram and a guard counted them one by one. Wikipedia +1. At the same time that a single prisoner was absorbed into the Soviet system, entire columns of men were moving east along rail lines that had been repaired overnight by Red Army railway troops. The fall of Berlin opened the last and largest harvest of German captives in the war's European theater. By the end of 1945, the Soviet Main Administration for Affairs of Prisoners of War and Internees had organized a vast network of camps, recorded by researchers as at least 267 base camps with about 3,200 branch sites and nearly 400 labor battalions scattered across the republics from the Baltic to Central Asia, with 178 special hospitals added to manage the flow of sick and wounded. In the first weeks after the city fell, NKVD and Smersh screening groups processed thousands of men per day inside improvised checkpoints set up in train stations, schools, and courtyards. The forms asked the same questions again and again: name, unit, role, where captured. SS service was treated as a key marker and often led to separation from the general prisoner population for further interrogation or trial preparation. Soviet records compiled after the war counted about 2.7 million members of the German armed forces taken into custody over the course of the conflict, with official Soviet figures reporting roughly 381,000 deaths in captivity. West German research after the war set a higher upper bound and estimated that more than 1 million died, while the historian Rüdiger Overmans proposed a maximum estimate near 1 million. The spread reflects the difficulty of counting men who were captured in chaotic mass surrenders, died during transit, or were never properly registered. But even the lowest number describes a mortality that dwarfed earlier European conflicts. The network that received them was built for labor as well as confinement. Columns of prisoners were sorted and sent to rebuild rail bridges and roads, to clear rubble and unexploded ordnance, to cut timber in northern forests, and to dig coal in the Donbass and the Urals. By late 1945 and into 1946, shipments of prisoners reached Kazakhstan and other distant regions. Witness statements and post-war interviews describe work brigades formed from men captured in Berlin and in the Halby pocket. Many had marched for days before they saw the inside of a rail car. In this wider movement of bodies and paperwork, the few men taken out of line for Moscow interrogations were the exception. Yet the exception drew intense interest. For the Soviet leadership, the words of a bunker courier could settle questions that had both political and psychological weight. Wikipedia +1. Misch entered that special channel as a living document, and his personal story now narrowed to rooms with bright lights and men who asked for the story of the final hours again and again. He later said that he was brought to Lubyanka and Lefortovo, and that the demand never changed. Tell us what you saw. Who signed which orders? How did the bodies look? He described physical assaults and the threat of worse if his answers did not satisfy the officers across the table. In his account, the nights bled into mornings until he could repeat the sequence of events in Berlin without thinking. He told them that he had heard the revolver shot from Hitler's room and that the smell of burning cloth in the garden stayed with him. He was young and slight and had never been a public speaker. The confession they wanted was not a confession of ideological crimes, but a timeline, a promise that the enemy leader was dead and that there had been no flight in the last minutes. Other men from that same circle underwent similar treatment and very long captivity. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet and an SS officer, was captured in early May, interrogated for years, and held by the Soviets until 1955. He later wrote that he felt time stop and then stretch into a long plane where days carried no meaning except the next questioning and the next transfer. The Soviets compiled dossiers from these men and presented digests to the highest leadership. One such dossier on the bunker deaths reached Stalin in December 1949, after years of collection and cross-checking. The point was not simply to prove the death of a tyrant. It was to build a state archive that established the Soviet version of the end of the war, and to use the bodies and words of prisoners as primary sources. Misch would not see those papers. He saw only the rooms and the faces and the days marked by the arrival of thin soup and bread. He remembered that a guard once told him that many Germans would never see home again. In a later summary, he said that he spent about 8 to 9 years as a prisoner and forced laborer before returning home, much of that time far from Moscow, in camps in Central Asia. Even in the short statements that survive, there is a pattern that fits the broader record. The individual is reduced to function. The function is evidence and labor. The person waits inside that function until the state decides he can be moved. Wikipedia's military. Wikipsa2. Beyond a single man, the numbers of 1945 tell a story of mass handling and selective severity that older listeners can follow without effort. Soviet authorities treated Waffen-SS personnel as a distinct category in interrogation and filtration. Those identified as members of criminal or ideologically committed units could face summary shootings on the battlefield, field trials by military tribunals, or very long terms under articles that defined participation in atrocities and war crimes. At the same time, the Soviet system required the work of hundreds of thousands of prisoners to meet post-war reconstruction targets. This created a two-track process. At the sharp end, men from SS formations were screened and pulled for trials and for intelligence value. In the wider flow, prisoners by the tens of thousands were moved to mines, railbeds, and factories. By the end of 1945, the GUPVI network covered the map. Rail yards sent trains north to Arkhangelsk and Vologda, east to the Urals, and south to the steppes. In the German lands left under Soviet occupation, many former Nazi camps were reused as Soviet special camps. A museum display in Berlin later listed at least 43,000 people who died in these post-war special camps on German soil. A small part of the total, but a number that helps listeners grasp how the war's end did not end the suffering. In Moscow, the separate handling of bunker witnesses produced reports that shaped the Soviet public story of Hitler's death and the fall of Berlin. In the provinces, the need for coal and timber and bricks shaped the lives of men who did not carry famous names. The statistical picture for German prisoners in Soviet hands remains contested in detail, but the scale is clear. Millions entered the system. Hundreds of thousands did not return. When the last trainloads came home in 1955 and 1956, a full decade had passed since the first days of May 1945. Misch belonged to the small set of men whose words were mined for the narrative of the end. The rest had no audience beyond the foreman who counted them at the start of a shift, and the doctor who wrote a number on a scrap of paper when a body was carried out of a barracks on a winter morning. The duality is what defines this chapter. One man sits in a bright room and repeats the last minutes of a dictator's life. Outside that room, a continent rebuilds itself on the labor of the defeated. The train from Berlin to Brest-Litovsk moved slowly, its motion more a vibration than a journey. Inside the wooden cars were hundreds of men, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Rochus Misch was among them, his wrists still red from the wire used to bind prisoners during the march. The convoy took 3 days to reach the Polish border. Guards opened the doors only to throw in buckets of thin soup and to count the bodies that no longer stirred. In later accounts from surviving prisoners, the pattern was identical. Overcrowding, dehydration, dysentery, and the sickly odor that came when the straw beneath them began to rot. Misch wrote years later that he tried to keep his mind blank and his eyes open to memorize details. The faces of the dead, the rhythm of the wheels, the brief flash of forest and village when a door was opened for air. Each stop meant another checkpoint, another change of locomotive. Soviet rail workers in quilted jackets hauled coal into engines under the watch of NKVD sentries. The prisoners were told that they were headed for assembly camps further east, but no one knew what that meant. When they finally reached Brest, the wagons were sprayed with lime, and the prisoners were made to march in single file through a cordon of soldiers holding bayonets at chest height. Misch noticed the smell of disinfectant and smoke, and behind a row of fences saw other Germans in striped overalls shoveling ash into carts. They were prisoners from earlier transports, men captured at Stalingrad, who had survived 2 years in Soviet custody. Many had no teeth left and moved with the slow caution of those who had learned that haste drew attention. The wider scene that surrounded these movements was enormous in scale. In the summer of 1945, The Soviet Union held roughly 2.3 million German soldiers scattered across the ruins of Eastern Europe. Prisoner registration centers operated in Silesia, Poland, and the occupied parts of Czechoslovakia, funneling captives eastward in endless lines. Stalin's government viewed the influx as both reparation and opportunity. The Red Army had lost more than 26 million citizens, half of them civilians, and the Soviet economy lay in ruins. Entire cities, Smolensk, Minsk, Kiev, had to be rebuilt from foundations. German prisoners became a labor force to fill that gap. Official orders from Moscow in June 1945 established quotas of man days for construction, mining, and forestry, assigning hundreds of thousands of Germans to labor brigades under the command of GUPVI, the main administration for prisoners of war and internees. Records from those months list millions of tons of coal extracted and thousands of kilometers of rail repaired by prisoner labor. At the same time, the Soviet propaganda machine portrayed these efforts as moral justice, the defeated aggressors rebuilding what they had destroyed. For the prisoners themselves, the work was less about justice and more about survival. The food ration for a healthy laborer was 800 grams of bread per day, with watery soup and occasional fish or porridge. Those unable to work often received half that amount. Mortality remained high through the first winter, particularly in the camps of Belarus and Western Russia, where housing and medical care were almost non-existent. By September 1945, Misch was moved again, this time in a smaller group by rail toward Minsk. The car was cleaner but colder, the air smelling of pine resin and smoke from nearby industries restarting after years of war. They arrived at a transit camp ringed with barbed wire and searchlights. Rows of canvas tents stood over ground still soft from summer rain. Guards shouted instructions in Russian, while interpreters repeated them in broken German. Remove belts, boots, and watches. Form lines of 20. Keep silence. The prisoners were deloused with powder and issued numbered tags. Misch's tag bore the Cyrillic spelling of his name and the code for a special handling prisoner, meaning someone believed to have information of high value. At night, he lay awake listening to the low voices of men who talked about home, about women they might never see again, about how long the Soviets would keep them. He began to understand that the end of the war did not mean release, and that the labels on their sleeves, SS, Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, now determined life or death. Guards often pulled men with the SS runes out of line and marched them away. Sometimes gunfire followed. Misch learned to stay silent when asked about his service. He said only that he had been a clerk in communications. The risk of truth was too high. Letters were forbidden, and no one knew whether families in Germany even knew they were alive. He later recalled one guard who smuggled scraps of newspaper to him, showing headlines about the Nuremberg trials and the division of Germany. That was the first time he understood that his country no longer existed in the form he had served. While individual prisoners tried to stay invisible, the Soviet state expanded its machinery of justice and labor. In the autumn of 1945, the NKVD established 3 major categories of camps for German captives. The first were the special camps used for interrogation and trial preparation, housing members of the SS, Gestapo, and senior Wehrmacht officers. The second were labor camps integrated into Soviet economic ministries, where prisoners worked in mines, forestry, construction, and agriculture. The third were hospital and recovery camps for the sick, though even these required light work when possible. Statistical returns from the NKVD archives show that by the end of that year, prisoners had already contributed over 14 million man-days of labor and produced 230 million rubles worth of goods. Mortality rates varied by region, but in camps such as Vyatka, Vorkuta, and Karaganda, they exceeded 20% due to cold and malnutrition. Survivors described eating grass and tree bark, using newspapers as clothing, and sleeping beside corpses for warmth. In this environment, news from Moscow that the German prisoners were to be kept indefinitely for reparations spread despair. Some tried to escape and were shot. Others collapsed quietly and were buried in numbered pits. Misch, by virtue of his supposed intelligence value, avoided the hardest labor for now, but he was not free from hunger or fear. When the first snow came, he was assigned to a work detachment repairing railway lines west of Minsk. The ground was frozen solid, and his hands split and bled from the cold. He learned to wrap rags around them before lifting steel rails. He counted the days not by calendar, but by how many times he saw a red sunset through the smoke over the horizon. In those moments, he realized that survival had become his only duty, and that the real battle now was not of armies, but of endurance. Winter 1945 pressed down on the camp like a living thing. The cold entered every joint, and the wind came through walls patched with paper and mud. Rochus Misch woke each morning to the sound of boots on frozen ground as guards made their rounds, their breath white in the lamplight. He shared his barrack with 60 men, most of them captured in Berlin or East Prussia. When one man stopped moving in the night, the others dragged the body outside before roll call to avoid punishment. The ground had frozen so hard that graves could not be dug. The corpses were stacked near the fence until spring. Misch later said that men no longer spoke of escape or of home, only of food. The daily ration was a lump of black bread and a bowl of thin soup that smelled of cabbage and earth. They ate snow to quiet the thirst. He tried to remember the taste of real coffee and the weight of his mother's hand on his shoulder when he left for service in 1937. But even memories of warmth began to fade. During the day, work columns walked 5 kilometers to a railway site outside the city. There, under the supervision of Soviet engineers, they lifted rails warped by explosions and replaced them with steel from new Soviet mills. Misch carried iron spikes in a sack, his fingers cracked and bleeding. He did not speak to the guards unless they spoke first. The few words of Russian he learned were enough to survive. Work, food, water. One morning, a fellow prisoner collapsed beside him and did not rise again. The guard looked once, shrugged, and ordered the others to keep working. The rhythm of the hammer and the scream of the wind replaced all other sound. In Moscow, far from the freezing camps, Soviet officials debated what to do with the mountain of prisoners now spread across the land. A directive issued in January 1946 confirmed that all SS personnel, regardless of individual role, were to be held indefinitely for investigation. Those with identifiable unit tattoos or listed in captured German rosters faced trials in military tribunals. The documents that survive from that period show the bureaucracy's scale. More than 300 filtration camps screened over 1 million men in the first post-war year. Each name was checked against captured SS archives, and those confirmed as members of combat or security divisions were marked for special punishment. Some were sent to work in the coal fields of Vorkuta and Norilsk, regions where temperatures reached 40 below zero, and where survival rates for the first year rarely exceeded 50%. Others were transferred to the Far East to work on rail construction toward Khabarovsk and Magadan. Soviet reports described these as re-education through labor, a phrase that covered both punishment and exploitation. The official record claimed that all prisoners received food and medical care according to international law. But letters and memoirs later collected in Germany tell a different story of starvation, disease, and exhaustion on a scale that no international observer witnessed. In one camp near Vyazma, mortality in the winter of 1945 to 46 reached almost 1 in 3. Typhus spread quickly through barracks where lice could not be controlled. Misch saw men scratching until their skin bled, their bodies covered in sores that never healed. When doctors came, they carried notebooks, but no medicine. The Soviet state's use of forced labor was not new. Since the 1930s, the Gulag system had operated as both a prison and an economic engine, producing timber, minerals, and infrastructure. After 1945, the arrival of millions of Germans transformed it again. By mid-1946, German prisoners were producing nearly 1/5 of all coal extracted in the Donets Basin and rebuilding hundreds of bridges and railways destroyed by retreating German armies. In some regions, they also helped construct new industrial towns. Soviet propaganda films of the era showed them smiling and well-fed, working alongside Soviet citizens in a spirit of reconstruction. The reality inside the camps was different. The prisoners worked 12-hour shifts under armed supervision, and accidents were common. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Hunger reduced men to skeletons. When the ground thawed in spring, mass graves were opened to move bodies to deeper pits. Misch witnessed one such exhumation outside Minsk. The stench stayed with him for years. Yet even amid this brutality, there were small signs of human exchange. Some local villagers, themselves scarred by the German occupation, brought potatoes or bread to trade for pieces of cloth or tools. Misch remembered one woman who gave him a boiled egg and said nothing. Her silence, he later wrote, felt heavier than any curse. As the months turned into years, the camp population thinned. The weakest died, the strongest adapted. Misch learned how to stitch boots from old sacks and how to melt snow on a shovel over a small fire to make tea from pine needles. When new transports arrived, he watched fresh men from Silesia and Hungary stumble off the trucks, still believing they would be released soon. By 1947, the NKVD reorganized its prisoner administration under the new Ministry of Internal Affairs. Quotas for labor production increased, and reports demanded better political reliability among guards. At the same time, the Soviet Union was shifting from wartime devastation to the early years of reconstruction. Industrial output had returned to near pre-war levels. German prisoners, though exhausted, remained vital to this recovery. Records from 1947 show that over 1 million still labored in Soviet industries, generating billions of rubles in value. Misch, now hardened by 2 winters, was moved to a camp near Smolensk where he worked in a sawmill feeding the timber industry. The sound of saws replaced that of hammers, but the rhythm of survival stayed the same. He still dreamed of Berlin, but could no longer picture it clearly. The map of his world had narrowed to fences and frost. Yet beneath the layers of exhaustion, he carried a kind of grim clarity, that the world outside the wire was rebuilding on the bones of those within it. For the Soviet Union, victory had become industry, and the German prisoners were both proof and instrument of that triumph. Spring 1947 arrived late, with the rivers still locked under ice. When the thaw came, the camp near Smolensk turned into a field of mud. Rochus Misch stood in ankle-deep water, sawing planks that would become barrack walls for new prisoners. He had learned to pace his movements to conserve strength. One steady cut, one breath. One glance toward the guard tower to make sure no one shouted. The Soviets called their work quotas norms, Every man had to produce a certain cubic volume of timber per day, and failure meant reduced rations. Misch's group rarely met the quota. Hunger hollowed them. Some gnawed at bark or boiled belts to quiet their stomachs. Disease came next. A cough would start and end in silence 2 weeks later when another body was carried out. Yet the saws never stopped. The timber went to rail sleepers, bridges, and the new apartment blocks rising in Moscow and Leningrad. The guards said little but wrote everything down. Misch began to understand that his labor was recorded like numbers in an accounting book. Each plank was worth calories and days of life. One morning, an NKVD officer inspected the camp, a man in a black leather coat who spoke fluent German. He gathered the prisoners in the yard and told them that those who worked well would be allowed to write letters home. None believed him, but the promise stirred something that had been dormant for years, the idea that they might still have families waiting. Across the Soviet Union, German prisoners were leaving their first camps and being redistributed to industrial sites. In the same year, over 1 million of them worked in construction, mining, and agriculture. They built factories in the Urals, roads in Belarus, and canals in Ukraine. Soviet archives later revealed that their output equaled that of entire Soviet ministries. The Stalingrad tractor plant, rebuilt with German labor, resumed production by 1948, turning out machines that would plow the same fields their armies had burned. Historians estimate that more than 700 industrial projects were completed with prisoner labor between 1945 and 1950. Mortality remained high, but the survivors became essential to Soviet reconstruction. At the same time, political trials of captured SS officers continued in Moscow, Minsk, and Riga. Public proceedings showcased men in tattered uniforms confessing to crimes against civilians. The sentences were predictable: death or 25 years of hard labor. These trials were meant to display Soviet justice and to remind the population of what they had suffered. In local villages near the camps, however, the hatred began to cool. Farmers trading bread for nails no longer spat at the Germans. Children sometimes followed work columns out of curiosity, not revenge. Slowly, a fragile coexistence emerged, born not of forgiveness, but of exhaustion. Misch saw that change in small gestures. A guard once handed him a cigarette stub and said nothing. Another time, during a storm, the same guard let the men shelter under the rail bridge they were repairing instead of forcing them to march back to camp. Acts like these did not erase the cruelty of the system, but they created brief moments of humanity that stayed in the memory longer than the blows. In July 1948, Misch's group was transferred again, this time south toward Ukraine. The rail journey took 5 days through endless forests and fields bright with wildflowers. They arrived at a camp outside Dnipropetrovsk, where the prisoners were assigned to a steel plant that had been nearly destroyed in 1941 and was now roaring back to life. The air smelled of coal dust and hot iron. The work was dangerous, but warmer than the sawmills. Misch shoveled slag and cleaned furnaces, his skin coated in soot that no amount of washing could remove. The foreman timed everything with whistles. Each pause meant a deduction in rations. He learned to move quickly, to read the rhythm of machines, and to keep silent. At night, the barracks trembled from the blast furnaces, and the glow from the chimneys painted the sky red. He thought of Berlin and of the different kind of fire that had ended there 3 years before. By now, Soviet policy toward prisoners was shifting. The Allied occupation authorities in Germany were pressing Moscow for repatriation of civilians and soldiers. Families wrote petitions, and the Red Cross sent inquiries that went unanswered. Stalin resisted. He saw the prisoners as compensation for the destruction of Soviet industry and as living proof of victory. Only in 1949 did limited releases begin, mostly of the sick and those unfit for labor. Out of the millions captured, only a few thousand returned that year. Misch was not among them. He had become a number in the camp rolls, his name transformed into Cyrillic script. His daily world revolved around iron and fire. Yet he noticed changes among the guards. New supervisors spoke more about quotas than ideology. The propaganda lectures about fascist crimes grew shorter. Rumors spread that Germany had been divided into zones, that new governments had formed in East and West. For the first time, the prisoners heard that some men were being sent not home but to the new East German police units forming under Soviet control. Misch was offered no such option. His past near Hitler made him too valuable as a witness and too suspect to release. Still, the pace of interrogations slowed, and by the end of 1949, he was just another laborer feeding ore into a furnace. When the first snow fell again, he felt no surprise. The war, for him, had not ended. It had only changed shape. The spring of 1950 brought rumors before it brought warmth. In the steel plant near Dnipropetrovsk, Rochus Misch and the other prisoners began hearing that Moscow might soon release thousands of men. No one knew if it was true. Each morning they still lined up outside the furnace halls, counted, inspected, and sent to work as before. The difference was in their faces, cautious hope instead of the blank endurance that had carried them through the years. Misch's hair had turned gray. His weight was half what it had been in 1945, and his back ached constantly from lifting slag buckets. Yet he had learned the rhythm of the camp, how to hide fatigue, when to speak, and when silence meant safety. One evening, a Soviet interpreter read aloud a bulletin saying that rehabilitated prisoners would soon be transferred west for repatriation. Misch stared at the words painted on the blackboard. Rehabilitated was not defined. Men whispered that the Soviets needed to reduce costs, that Germany was rebuilding and no longer an enemy, and that even Stalin was growing old. Weeks passed before anything changed. Then, one morning, in May, a list of names was pinned to the wall of the barracks. Misch's was not there. He folded his hands and returned to work, understanding at last that for men connected to Hitler, the war was not yet finished in Soviet eyes. In Moscow, a wider transformation was underway. The Soviet Union had entered a new phase, consolidation after devastation. By 1950, the major industries destroyed during the war had surpassed pre-war output. The network of camps still stretched from the Baltic to Siberia, holding more than 1.5 million Germans. But the focus of the regime was shifting from vengeance to utility. Reports from the Ministry of Internal Affairs described prisoners as an economic reserve, vital to ongoing projects in construction, mining, and agriculture. At the same time, a political thaw was beginning. The Allied powers had reached new agreements about repatriation, and East Germany was being groomed as a loyal socialist state. Soviet planners realized that keeping too many prisoners could hinder these diplomatic goals. In the early months of 1950, thousands of German civilians and non-combatants were released, particularly the sick and elderly. But the core of the SS prisoners, officers, and those tied to the Nazi hierarchy remained behind barbed wire. They were concentrated in a few large camps, Vorkuta, Karaganda, and Cherepovets among them, where production quotas were highest and security most severe. That same year, Misch's work detail was moved north to a camp near Cherepovets on the Shexna River, part of the Volga system. The camp bordered a vast construction site where a new steel complex was rising out of swamp and forest. It would become one of the largest plants in Europe, producing millions of tons of steel each year, and it was built largely by the hands of prisoners. Misch was assigned to scaffolding work, climbing frames slick with ice to fasten bolts and carry tools. The temperature dropped below freezing by mid-September. Guards measured their days not by time but by production numbers scratched onto clipboards. Inside the half-built factory, the clang of hammers mixed with the roar of furnaces. Misch's section worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer when the foreman demanded extra output. He saw men fall from the scaffolds, their bodies carried away without ceremony. In the evenings, when the siren announced the end of work, the prisoners walked back through snow so thick it erased their footprints within minutes. Misch later said that he stopped counting the days because it hurt too much. He began marking the seasons instead. The smell of thaw, the first mosquitoes, the sound of ice breaking on the river. These small signs became his measure of time. By 1952, the death of millions had faded into statistics, and Soviet newspapers spoke of peace and progress. German prisoners appeared less frequently in propaganda films, but they were still there, finishing the reconstruction of roads, dams, and mines. Some camps introduced literacy classes and political lectures about Marxism and the peaceful labor of reconstruction. Misch attended because attendance was mandatory. He learned to read Cyrillic letters more clearly and could now follow the slogans painted on factory walls. The guards no longer beat men for small mistakes. Discipline had become bureaucratic rather than violent. For the first time in 7 years, he felt the faint outline of normal life returning. Scheduled meals, set work hours, and the distant rumor of release. Stalin's death in March 1953 would change everything, but Misch did not know that yet. That winter, as he leaned against a wall of warm bricks near the furnace, he heard a guard mutter that Moscow was changing, that the old man would not live forever. Misch looked at the smoke drifting into the dark and said nothing. He had learned that survival depended on silence. Yet deep inside he felt something shift, a sense that history was moving again, and that perhaps, after so many frozen years, the end of captivity might finally be possible. March 1953 began with whispers and ended with silence. In the camp near Cherepovets, the guards moved slower, and the commandant stopped shouting. One morning, before roll call, a Soviet officer gathered the prisoners and read from a paper that trembled in his hand. Joseph Stalin was dead. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the officer folded the paper and walked away. The men stared at one another, unsure how to react. They had lived 8 years under his rule, many believing they would die there. Misch watched the guards that day more than the prisoners. Some looked stunned, others almost relieved. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the camp began to change. The beatings stopped. The political lectures vanished. Food rations, though still poor, were distributed with more regularity. New directives came from Moscow, replacing the old commandant with a younger officer who seemed more interested in paperwork than punishment. The prisoners felt something that had been absent for nearly a decade, uncertainty mixed with hope. Misch sensed that his time in the Soviet Union might finally be ending. Across the country, the death of Stalin triggered a seismic shift. The Soviet leadership entered a phase of reform known as the Thaw. Lavrenti Beria, head of the secret police, announced measures for the review and repatriation of foreign prisoners of war. Within months, tens of thousands of Germans were released from camps in Ukraine, Belarus, and European Russia. Reports from the Soviet archives show that by the end of 1953, over 300,000 prisoners had been sent home. But the SS men remained excluded. The Kremlin insisted they be examined individually for war crimes before any decision. The German Democratic Republic, newly formed in the Soviet zone, pleaded for their return, promising to re-educate them into loyal socialists. For a time, those requests were ignored. Misch, whose name appeared in captured Gestapo rosters, was summoned for interrogation. 2 NKVD officers questioned him for hours about Hitler's bunker, his movements in April 1945, and whether he had knowledge of orders for extermination campaigns. Misch told them the truth. He had been a telephone operator, not a policymaker. He described Hitler's final days in the bunker, the exhaustion, the confusion, and the sound of artillery above. When the questioning ended, one officer simply nodded. "You will wait," he said. Misch returned to his barrack, unsure whether that meant days or years. During the next year, the machinery of release ground slowly forward. Camps closed one by one as men were shipped west. In Cherepovets, the roll calls grew shorter each week. Columns of prisoners boarded trains carrying them toward the Polish border, some weeping openly. Misch watched them go, feeling both envy and disbelief. In late summer 1954, his turn finally came. His name appeared on a list, marked with a red stamp reading transfer. The guards searched him one last time and handed back the small metal tag he had worn since 1945. The journey back across the Soviet Union took 10 days. The train passed through forests, cities, and endless plains, each familiar yet strange. Misch noticed that the country he was leaving no longer bore the scars of war. Factories smoked, trains ran on time, and children waved from station platforms. When the train crossed into Poland, the guards no longer carried rifles. They shook hands with the prisoners and wished them luck. Misch stared out the window as the sun set behind the birch trees. For the first time in 9 years, he dared to believe he might see Germany again. The return process was as bureaucratic as the captivity had been. At the repatriation center near Frankfurt on der Oder, Soviet officers handed each man a document stating, "Released from Soviet custody." They were weighed, photographed, and examined by doctors. The average prisoner had lost more than 20 kilograms during captivity. Many were too weak to stand for long. When Misch stepped across the demarcation line into the German Democratic Republic, he felt as though he were walking into another world. Towns had been rebuilt, streets renamed, flags changed. The people looked at the returning men with a mix of pity and unease. Some saw heroes, others saw ghosts from a past they wanted to forget. For Misch, the adjustment was slow. He found temporary work as a carpenter, using the skills learned in the camp sawmills. He never spoke publicly about his years in Soviet captivity, not out of fear, but because words could not contain them. He once told a journalist that he had walked through the end of a century and come back alive. The Soviet system that had swallowed him for nearly a decade remained beyond his understanding, vast, efficient, and indifferent. By 1955, almost all surviving German prisoners had been released. Out of the 2.3 million taken by the Soviets, roughly 1 million had died in captivity from hunger, disease, or exhaustion. The survivors carried invisible scars. their silence forming one of the darkest shadows of the post-war years. In the Soviet Union, the camps that once held them were repurposed for new prisoners, political dissenters, writers, and peasants accused of hoarding grain. The cycle of labor and control continued, but the faces changed. Misch lived quietly in East Berlin, working as a decorator and avoiding politics. Decades later, when asked what he remembered most, he said it was not the hunger or the cold, but the sound of the trains, the endless rhythm of movement across a land too vast to escape. In that sound, he said, was the history of his generation: victory, defeat, and survival. The years after release brought no peace of mind, only distance. Rochus Misch, like thousands of other survivors, returned to a Germany divided not only by occupation zones but by memory. The new East German government welcomed returning soldiers publicly, yet privately it distrusted them. Former SS men were considered politically unreliable. Misch, who had once served in the heart of Hitler's communications network, became one of many men who lived quietly on the edges of society. He rented a small flat in East Berlin and found work painting walls for government housing projects. The sound of the city rebuilding, hammers, cranes, the hiss of welding torches, reminded him of the Soviet camps, of the endless clang of steel that had filled his days in captivity. When he walked to work past the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, now fenced and half-buried, he sometimes imagined he could still hear the voices of 1945 echoing under the rubble, but he never spoke of them aloud. Silence had kept him alive for 9 years. He did not unlearn it easily. In the broader world, the story of the Soviet camps remained hidden behind official language. In Moscow's statistics, the deaths of nearly 1 million German prisoners appeared as non-returnees. Western historians would not see the full records until the 1990s, when Soviet archives finally opened. Those documents revealed the magnitude of what had happened. Between 1941 and 1956, over 4 million Axis prisoners passed through the GUPVI system, and roughly a quarter perished. German prisoners alone performed more than 1.1 billion man-days of labor, producing goods worth billions of rubles and rebuilding much of the Soviet industrial base. In places like Vorkuta, Norilsk, and Karaganda, entire towns owed their existence to forced labor. The official Soviet justification was simple: reparation for the destruction of their homeland. But behind the numbers lay a human geography of hunger, frost, and endurance that no reparations could balance. When the surviving men returned home, they brought stories that did not fit any political narrative. Brutality mixed with kindness, despair balanced by small mercies, enemies who shared bread across language barriers. These accounts would take decades to be spoken openly. For Misch, life settled into a rhythm that felt like penance. He married, raised a daughter, and worked until retirement, never joining any veterans groups or party organizations. In private, he wrote down fragments of memory in old-school notebooks, names of camps, smells of places, the faces of guards he could still see when he closed his eyes. The one constant memory, he said later, was the sight of the first electric lights he saw when the train crossed into Soviet territory in 1945. They burned through the frost like stars, a sign of power that terrified and fascinated him. That same light had followed him for years through the blast furnaces of Dnipropetrovsk and Cherepovets, through the glow of molten steel and the northern dawn. In those lights, he saw both victory and captivity. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Misch was an old man. Television cameras showed crowds flooding the checkpoints, people hugging, crying, laughing. He watched quietly from his window. Freedom, he thought, was not an event, but a long process, a train that sometimes arrived decades late. The final reckoning for the German prisoners of the Soviet Union came not through trials or reparations, but through memory itself. Historians would later call their survival the long captivity, a term that joined them with the millions of Soviet citizens who had endured their own Gulag sentences. Together they formed a hidden ledger of the 20th century, one side written in conquest, the other in reconstruction. Misch died in 2013, one of the last living witnesses to both Hitler's bunker and Stalin's camps. His life traced the entire arc of Europe's descent and recovery, from dictatorship through defeat to uneasy peace. He once said that he had learned two things in his years of captivity. First, that ideology dies faster than hunger. Second, that the line between victor and prisoner is thinner than anyone wants to believe. The Soviet system that had enslaved him had also, in its strange way, taught him what endurance meant. For the men who returned, survival itself became the final act of defiance. And so the story closes where it began, in a Europe rebuilding on the ruins of certainty. The Soviet camps, once instruments of vengeance, became relics of a vanished empire. The prisoners who built factories, mined coal, and raised cities from ashes vanished into the background of history, their labor buried beneath statistics. Yet their experience remained proof of how vast systems of power can consume and reshape the human spirit. In 1945, they entered captivity as soldiers of a fallen empire. By 1955, they emerged as witnesses to something larger than defeat. What the Soviets did to them shocked the world when the truth finally emerged, not only for its cruelty, but for its scale. The revelation that even in victory, humanity could be stretched to its breaking point. And still, out of that ordeal, men like Rochus Misch walked back into the world, alive but changed, carrying within them the unspoken history of a century.